That was a lot of energy and a lot of great advice that we all have to take. I have the great pleasure of introducing a very special guest, our keynote speaker today. We are glad that she was able to get here to join us for this Congress, because it wasn't easy. She is the Director General of the National Art and Cultural Museum Complex called Art Arsenal. Until recently, she was the board member of the Ukrainian Institute and the East Europe Foundation, as well as the head of the program board, Social Capital Program, at the International Renaissance Foundation. She was the head of analytics at Promova Consulting Company and a founding member of Culture 2025, independent platform for the development of a national strategy for culture. During 2014, Ms. Ostrovska-Liuta served as the first Deputy Minister of Culture of Ukraine. As the Deputy Minister, she supported participative development of the National Strategy for Culture and Development of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. She also advocated autonomy for the institutions of culture and equal rights for state-owned and civil society institutions of culture. During her career, she was the first deputy to the head of the National Committee for UNESCO and a member of the Ukraine-Poland Presidential Advisory Committee. Our speaker today will not take questions, but she will when she speaks again later in the week. Without further ado, I invite you to join me in welcoming from Kiev, Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olesia. One evening, about a year ago, I was sitting with my daughter Solomia in our kitchen in Kiev, talking. Solomia was 16 at the time, deeply interested in world history and very concerned about Russia's claims that Ukraine did not exist. Why do they do that, she asked. It is impossible to erase the whole society and the memory about it. They have already tried so hard and it didn't work. That's just not doable. She referred to many events and experiences in the 20th century. First, the Holodomor, the artificial political famine imposed on Ukraine in 1932-1933, parallel to Stalin's industrialization. The central goal of the famine was to pacify Ukrainian peasants who rebelled time after time against Russian Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had invaded Ukraine and crushed the Ukrainian Republic prior to it. The famine Holodomor led to almost 4 million deaths, many cases of cannibalism, and some of them described in mind-blowing poetry, a sharp population decline, and subsequently the policy of population replacement. Those were people from other Soviet republics, mainly from Russia, who came to live in the houses of those who had perished. The famine was followed by the mass execution of Ukrainian cultural figures, and then by physical destruction of their artworks and banning their poems, novels, theater plays, etc., etc. Take the Ukrainian avant-garde theater of the 1920s. Its central phenomenon was called Berezil Theater. It operated in Kharkiv, a North Ukrainian city that withstood the violent siege by Russian troops through the spring and summer of 2022. Many of its neighborhoods ruthlessly disrupted by artillery, drones, cruise, and ballistic missiles. Kharkiv is still being bombed as we talk. A century ago in Kharkiv, Brazil Theatre and its founder, a great avant-garde director, Les Kurbas, experimented with movement, scenography, and new media. For example, in his plays, moving images of the time film was incorporated in the performance on the stage. Brazil was the center of the flourishing cultural life. In the 1930s, Les Kurbas was killed in a place called Sandarmoh, together with hundreds of other Ukrainian authors. His theater was destroyed, prohibited, and, as it seemed, forgotten. Even research on Brazil was dangerous and could lead to a prison sentence. Any cultural rights, such as the right to speak the Ukrainian language and use it for cultural production, were labeled Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism, just like Les Kurbas himself was. The last Ukrainian author to be accused of bourgeois nationalism and die in the Gulag was Vasyl Stus, a brilliant poet and remarkably brave dissident. He died after a hunger strike in 1985, already after Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost had started. I was 7 years old at the time, and it's shocking how recent this history is. As a result of this policy of denying Ukrainians' right to exist as a separate cultural, let alone political, entity, the Ukrainian language was highly unprestigious, even in Ukraine. The Ukrainian cultural scene was generally seen as dull and backward. And you will ask, seen by whom? By the universal Soviet authoritative figures that always happened to be Russian. And yet, as my daughter Solomia said, this didn't work. Ukraine and Ukrainians were still there. A day or two before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, we all watched Vladimir Putin speak to his nation. He repeated once again that there was no such thing as Ukraine. And even though it was impossible to believe what was staring us in the face, a war of the scale of World War II, we in Ukraine knew that Putin was utterly wrong. Ukraine very much existed. Ukrainians existed too. And our cultural institutions were there to prove it. So we got prepared. I spoke to my team at every staff meeting and on many other occasions about what might be ahead of us. Mystetskyi Arsenal, or the Art Arsenal where I work, is a multidisciplinary institution placed in the very heart of Kiev, in the huge building of 18th century armory facility that was built as a part of Kiev's fortress. It is Ukraine's largest cultural space. Our program includes contemporary art, books and literature, performing art element, and most endangered today, museum collection. There is Ukrainian avant-garde, contemporary art, and archaeology of the place in it. So we got prepared. We developed our own action plan for the case of an emergency. At the time, we could not quite imagine what that emergency would be. But we knew that there would be two elements of the plan. A, protect the heritage, the museum collection and the historical building, as well as the institutional documents. B, spread the word about what is happening in Ukraine. There was a third element of the plan that we could not fully prepare for. As a cultural institution, we were not equipped to protect our own people, the employees of the Art Arsenal. But we, as a team, knew that we needed to create every possibility for people to take care of their safety by themselves. In practice, that meant that there had to be clear guidance and only a minimal number of team members who needed to arrive at the arsenal in case of emergency. And again, it was very hard to bring yourself to believe that the emergency would be a World War II-style missile strike on Kiev. Yet, it was clear that in any scenario, the main part of the team had to focus on their safety and the safety of their families. Early in the morning of February 24th, just after everyone in Kiev woke up to the sound of rockets landing on our city, I got a call from a friend. She said she was driving her two small kids to the western part of Ukraine, as far as possible from the Russian border and closer to Poland. She had a seat in her car for our daughter, too. That friend knew that I was to stay in Kiev to care for my institution, just like her husband, a prominent journalist, who had to stay in Kiev to host a national TV broadcast for the whole of Ukraine. So that is how it was. We took our daughter to Bucha, a suburb that later became tragically famous for the atrocities inflicted by the Russians on the remaining residents. And a friend drove our Solomia from there to the safer provinces of Ukraine, while we drove her husband to Kiev. Since that morning, he literally lived in his TV studio and served as an anchor in all senses to all Ukrainians for the next few months. Our child then traveled from town to town, sometimes with complete strangers, and across many borders until she came to stay with my family in a distant country. It was not before mid-October that we could see her for the next time. On my way from Bucha to the arsenal, I wrote 2 letters to my team. The first one activated the emergency plan and told the rest of the team that they were free to relocate to safer places outside of Kiev. Interestingly, there was the word I used, relocate, not evacuate. Even my language still resisted and would not recognize the magnitude of the catastrophe. The second letter was to the book and literature department of the arsenal, as I knew those colleagues had decided to stay in Kiev for the moment. I asked them to draft a letter to our international partners to tell everyone what was unfolding before our eyes. Those 2 emails set our understanding of a cultural institution's mission in a country facing a military attack, especially the genocidal attack that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine. Firstly, it is crucial to focus on heritage protection. It is a valuable part of the heritage of the whole of humanity, but there is one more aspect to it. In Putin's world, that is our identity and sovereignty that must be erased. While these are the cultural artifacts, be they archaeological objects, historical buildings, or artworks that stand for the opposite. Once you know about these artifacts, it is much harder to believe that the people who created them never existed. Ukrainian cultural heritage has been physically erased in many ways through the 20th century. Think that both world wars, the first and the second, were fought on the territory of Ukraine. In the past 100 years, no single generation in Ukraine hasn't witnessed a war, either our parents and grandparents, ourselves, or our children. However, my generation was probably the first one to actually inherit and be fully in charge of some tangible objects. So protecting what was in the care of a cultural institution was essential. Secondly, our mission was to convey the message. We tried to reach out to as many people outside of Ukraine as we could to show them that we existed, that we had our own story and therefore every right to survive as a country, as a society, and as people. Isn't it strange that we had this need at all? That we were so eager to tell about ourselves? The basis was the same. Faced with the forceful denial of your right to exist, you feel a fulcrum inside yourself. That is your culture and your ability to create. You try to connect through culture with other societies. And isn't it a natural mission for every cultural organization? And what about the people? People who still create artifacts and protect institutions. They pose a danger to the invader just as well. If artifacts prove the existence of a particular society, living creators do so even more. Each of us was free to flee the country and become a refugee, and still is. But that is physical presence in a specific place that resonates, that helps you grasp the reality and describe it to yourself and others. This is how citizenship is produced, by being physically present in a place of rupture in times of need. This is how institutional fabric, its very tissue, is produced too. Therefore, many Ukrainian cultural figures chose to stay in Ukraine. One of them is Serhiy Zhadan, Ukraine's most celebrated poet of our time, often referred to as the voice of the generation. He stayed in Kharkiv, the city bombarded from behind the nearby Russian border day by day. He stayed through the darkest hours. One day, a friend of mine said, "I feel terrified when I think of Serhiy Zhadan walking Kharkiv streets just now." And I thought, but this is a matter of his dignity. He cannot leave his hometown when it is torn apart. This is how many Ukrainian creators felt at the beginning of this invasion and how they still feel. Yet many of them were women with children who were forced to make choices that no one should be forced to do, and many had to flee. So here's one more mission of a cultural institution: to give a platform to creators working in unthinkable conditions, to help them connect with their audience and reflect on the world in front of their eyes. Even more so, as we understand that Ukrainian cultural figures are among the prime targets of the invading Russians. There were many warnings in the media citing intelligence services that the Russian military had lists of people in Ukraine to be executed or sent to filtration camps. That seemed both familiar from the previous generation experience. Think of the story of Vasil Stus, and phantasmagoric at the same time. It proved tragically accurate quite soon. One of the most heartbreaking is the story of the poet and children's writer Volodymyr Vakulenko. He lived in a village that was invaded by Russians on the very first days of 2022. Vakulenko was a single father and lived with his 14-year-old son diagnosed with autism. For him, it was even harder to leave his home because a precipitous change was unbearable for his child, so he stayed. His body was excavated from a mass grave in late autumn after Russians retreated as a result of Ukrainian counteroffensive. As we learned later, shot in the head with a Makarov pistol, he died on the village street, and his corpse remained there unburied for another month. Vakulenko left a diary that was physically and literally dug out from the soil of his garden by another writer, Victoria Melino. One thing is particularly striking in that diary. Vakulenko expects that someone in his village will report on him as a Ukrainian writer, and that will be fatal. There are more such stories, including the principal conductor of Kherson Music and Drama Theater, Yuri Karpatenko. Kherson is a southern Ukrainian city that was occupied by Russia until late autumn and proclaimed by Putin to be an integral part of the Russian Federation. Karpatenko refused to collaborate with the occupying forces and was shot to death at his home. If these are the threats that individual creators are facing, if that is the price, what is the importance of their work, their projects, artworks, institutions they create? To put it very simply, is it worth it? And here we come to one more mission of a cultural institution, that is self-reflection. Faced with the deadly threat, society focuses on its survival. The next morning is your horizon. But what happens to a society, to communities and individual people when there is no prospect for the future? When it is too hard to bring yourself to think beyond your home, your family, and your community? First, we lose our institutions dedicated to reflection and to unpractical thinking. Scientific and research institutions, cultural centers, theaters, serious publishing, universities. We've seen it in Ukraine when post-Soviet poverty put an end to much of intellectual activity. And then society collapses in terms of its ability to produce meaningful knowledge and, in the end, to self govern. Isn't it Putin's dream for Ukraine just the long way? Therefore, it is crucial to maintain centers that expand your intellectual horizon and the borders of your sensitivity. One has to keep one's ability to reflect and self-reflect, and cultural institutions must be there to serve as places of reflection. Our exhibitions, discussions, performances, texts are the means to examine the depth of our understanding. In a place like Ukraine today, you do not need much sensual stimulation, but you desperately need a space to keep your horizon high. That's why the Art Arsenal in Kiev is open and receiving visitors now. Our current contemporary art exhibition, The Heart of Earth, tells the story of the interconnection between a human and the earth she cares about global food security. In the end, as we learned through this war, that is the Ukrainian steppes, where much of the world's food is produced. It highlights the implications of the imperialist approach to earth and people on this earth. Severe environmental violence is among them. Did you know that Ukraine is the most mined territory in the world now? We prepared this exhibition through the autumn, often sheltering in a bomb shelter while the missiles were hitting our electricity grids. That made the process of operating an exhibit much more complicated. After each attack, you do not know when electricity will be provided and what your opening hours should be. But we experiment. Everyone in Kiev is very devoted to keeping our institutions working and even finding every possibilities for fun and joy. For example, we did have a bountiful Christmas party for the team this year, and we planned it on staff meetings held in bomb shelters in the darkness as the electricity was off. It was dramatic, yes, but there was also much of human warmth and joy and sympathy. Yet, one has to make every effort not to accept it as a new normality. One has to hope and aim for the better. Honored and humbled at the perspective of giving the keynote speech to you today, I drafted it sitting on the floor in the corridor in my Kiev apartment on New Year's Eve. There was a missile attack going on, and that is why I was in the corridor. You have to find the safest place in your apartment, which is behind two solid walls, and hide there. There's usually a spot in the corridor or in the bathroom. In Ukrainian cities, we have adopted to living and working like that. But it is crucial. It is essential to remember that this is abnormal. And I can't thank you enough for helping me to keep this understanding. And that's probably one more thing that culture is capable of. Help see the strangeness of certain things, put the usual under a spotlight and sense its absurdity, and try to change it accordingly. Thank you.